Hello! Today, we are going to explain the plot of the movie The Stepfather, which was released in 2009. Well, let's start with the story. A man in a suburban house in Utah named Grady Edwards casually shaved his beard, dyed his hair, and removed his contact lenses. After showing up with a new look, Grady made a cup of coffee and toast with peanut butter. It was discovered that Grady had killed his wife and 3 children and then left the house in his car. Police have reportedly found similar cases of slaughter in other locations. The police suspect that Grady, who is still a mysterious figure with the status of a widower, is now wandering around somewhere. It turns out that Grady has moved to another town, and in a supermarket he meets a woman, Susan Harding, with her 2 children. Grady deliberately stole the woman's attention and behaved very well to impress the woman. He told her that he was a widower who was left by his wife and child due to an accident. And sure enough, what Grady planned seemed to work to attract her, because in the parking lot, the woman approached Grady and said that she had just divorced her ex-husband. Susan then asked Grady to get to know her, and Grady was more than happy to oblige.
The newspaper to have time to disappear.
6 months later, Susan's first child, Michael Harding, returned home and was met at the airport by his girlfriend, Kelly Porter. Michael complained that his mother didn't care enough about him to even pick him up, but Kelly told him that what he thought wasn't true. When Michael was invited by Kelly to the backyard of the house, it turned out that everyone had welcomed him. Grady then greeted Michael, who had never met his stepson before. Susan then told Grady about a job offer to her future husband, and Grady agreed to Susan's sister's good intentions. Shortly thereafter, Grady met Michael and invited him to the basement for a quick talk. Michael agreed and then met his future stepfather in the basement. There they talked about several things, one of which was that Grady would convince his mother so that Michael would no longer have to go to military school and should live with them, while Michael could attend swimming practice at his old school. Michael thought his future stepfather was just making small talk, but it turned out that Grady really met with the athlete's coach the next day and persuaded him. When he returned home, Grady had given Michael the key to the locker at the pool, and the boy was surprised at how Grady could do that. Michael seemed impressed with what Grady had done, as did Susan, who saw that her future husband was caring and loving toward her children. The next day, Susan was cooking while her youngest child was playing a game, and Susan yelled at her youngest son to turn down the volume on the video game. Finally, Grady came over and showed his true colors, yelling and being rude to his future stepson. In the kitchen, Grady noticed Michael enjoying a date in the pool. Grady briefly mentioned whether Susan was too free with her son, but Susan denied it, saying that they had known each other since elementary school. Grady was then asked not to be conservative. During dinner, Susan's ex-husband stopped by the house. His intention was to pick up his son to enjoy the weekend, but Michael was reluctant to meet his biological father, so he chose to stay at the dinner table. The next day, Susan's neighbor, Mrs. Cutter, visited her home and showed her a sketch made by the American police that resembled Grady's face. Susan clearly denied that the sketch could be her future husband, then told the funny story to Grady, who was greeted with a joke. Meanwhile, Michael, who had just woken up, secretly eavesdropped on their conversation. After Grady said his goodbye to work, he visited Mrs. Cutter's house. Grady greeted Mrs. Cutter directly, which made the middle-aged woman a little scared. At noon, Grady had an appointment with Michael. At a fast food restaurant, Grady asked Michael to be his escort when he married his mother. Michael had no objection to accompanying Grady in the wedding. When he returned home from work, Grady gave Mrs. Cutter a sarcastic look, which made Mrs. Cutter even more convinced that Grady was a fugitive wanted by the American police. While Mrs. Cutter was playing with her cats, the doorbell rang, but when she opened the door, no one was there. Feeling strange, she re-entered her house and saw one of her cats acting strangely. She, who was astonished, then chased the hiding cat, and when she got up, Grady was already behind her to stab her. Mrs. Cutter was then grabbed by Grady and unceremoniously thrown into the basement. He immediately smothered the middle-aged woman's nose and mouth to death. While Michael and his girlfriend were relaxing in the pool, Michael told Kelly that Grady had asked him to be his best man. Michael said that he would soon have a new father, but he could not call Grady a father. Kelly assured him that Michael would get used to it on his own after he tried. After relaxing in the pool, Michael invited Kelly to join him in his room, and Kelly, noticing, reminded Michael that the door to his room was open again. When Michael checked it, Grady appeared in front of him, and he was upset because Grady was peeping at him. During the night, Michael was lectured by Grady and Susan for making out too much. Shortly after, Susan's 2 kids came home, and Susan's ex-husband suddenly showed up with fiery emotions and scolded Grady. It turned out that Sean had told his father how rude Grady had been to him. They almost fought. But Michael took the initiative to separate his father and take him outside. Michael's father revealed that he did not trust Grady, but in fact Michael himself did not fully know Grady at that time. Meanwhile, Susan meets Sean in the room. Shortly after, Grady arrived to apologize directly to Sean.
It's been a year.
Susan seemed disappointed with the actions Grady had taken against her son earlier. She then scolded Grady for being rude to her children. Meanwhile, at night, Michael woke up after receiving a message from his father thanking him for seeing him. Soon he heard the sound of a person being restless. Slowly, Michael approached him. On the ground floor, it turned out that Grady was restless, thinking about the plans he had built falling apart. Grady realized he was being watched by Michael, but when he checked, Michael had returned to his room. The next day, Grady received an offer to become a permanent employee for successfully selling a house. But it was not good news for Grady because he could not fill out the form with his real identity. At home, Grady told Susan that he wanted to quit working at her sister's office because the real estate business was not his passion. Susan then said goodbye and went to hang out with her sister at a bar. Shortly after, Susan's ex-husband came to visit. Moments later, the phone rang and Susan told Grady that he had to avoid her ex-husband because she didn't want a fight between them. However, it turned out that Susan's ex-husband had investigated Grady's background and told Michael that Grady had a big lie. This threatened Grady and forced him to eliminate Susan's ex-husband. Michael, who had heard voices from downstairs, checked the basement, but his bad feeling was stopped because he did not want to be so close to Grady. Meanwhile, at the bar, Susan's sister seemed to be getting suspicious because Grady had no clear identity. But Susan, blinded by love, was busy defending her future husband. Meanwhile, Michael, unaware that his father had been eliminated by Grady, was disappointed when Susan approached him and criticized his father for not coming. Michael swore about Grady and made Susan angry. The next morning, Mrs. Cutter was found dead by her nephew, and Michael watched the police arrive across the street. Soon, Grady came out of the house and asked the mailman, who told him that Mrs. Cutter could not be contacted, and when her nephew visited her, she was found dead. However, Michael was a little surprised when Grady told Susan in detail about the cause of Mrs. Cutter's death. All these strange events were told to Kelly, but she didn't believe Michael, thinking that Michael was just prejudiced against Grady. Grady then approached them and said goodbye because he was going to pick up Sean and Beth. After Grady left, Michael and Kelly rushed to find evidence to reveal who Grady really was. But on the way, Susan called Grady to tell him not to pick up the kids because her position was closer, so Grady returned home. When he arrived home, Grady found Michael and Kelly were not in the pool, which certainly made him panic, as well as Kelly and Michael, who knew that Grady had now arrived home. Unfortunately, Michael and Kelly's footprints did not disappear on the floor, making it easy for Grady to find them. However, Michael and Kelly rushed to save themselves and returned to the pool, but Grady was well aware of the signs that they had suspected him. During the night, Grady then met Michael in his room. Michael was surprised by Grady's attitude, which seemed to threaten him with subtle but violent actions when he banged on his shoes. The things that Grady did made Michael even more convinced that there was something wrong with his future stepfather. Michael then checked the fugitive list site and found the sketch that Mrs. Cutter was referring to. The next day, Michael told Kelly about the sketch that resembled Grady, but Kelly did not immediately believe that Grady was the culprit. Again, Kelly thinks that Michael is too prejudiced against his future stepfather. In fact, Michael is alone with his suspicions, which makes Kelly upset and then leaves him. While in the kitchen, Kelly ran into Grady, who then made small talk and seemed to signal that he knew what Michael was doing. Kelly, frightened, leaves him. While Michael was still thinking about who Grady really was, he suddenly received a message from his father, Jay. When he tried to call, he heard a ringing sound coming from the basement. Michael immediately rushed to make sure while continuing to call him. But his action was caught by Grady, who then argued that it was his cell phone. When Susan returned home, Grady told her that he had gotten a good job with a high salary, but that he would have to travel. During the conversation, Michael secretly took a picture of Grady. Afterwards, Grady and Michael seemed to be in a cold war as they watched each other's movements. Susan wanted to take her 2 children camping. She invited Grady, but he refused, saying that he had a job. When Susan and the 2 kids left, Grady started the action. By the time Michael came out of the bathroom, Grady was already in front of him and asked if Michael had any plans tonight. Michael planned to meet Kelly, and Grady then warned him that there would be a big storm tonight. However, when he entered his room, Michael was surprised to find that his room was tidier than before. so he immediately checked his cell phone and searched for Grady's picture. Sure enough, the photo of Grady that he had taken earlier suddenly disappeared, and Michael, in a panic, ran into Kelly and told her about it. But Kelly did not believe him. Meanwhile, Susan's sister, who was very sure that something was wrong with Grady, sent Susan an email. But unfortunately, Grady read the email and deleted it from Susan's computer. He then calls to cancel the daily newspaper subscription, and Grady's actions then target Susan's sister, Jackie. When Susan's sister returned home, she walked into a trap set by Grady, who deliberately placed an umbrella in the middle of the pool to lure Jackie into picking it up. When Jackie tried to take the umbrella, Grady appeared from behind and immediately drowned Jackie, killing her instantly. Apparently worried that her sister had called her without leaving a message, Susan returned home as soon as she could. But she was surprised by Grady's very suspicious movements when he suddenly appeared in front of her. But Susan didn't think anything bad would happen and hurried to sleep. Susan said that she was uncomfortable during the thunderstorm because it was hard for her to sleep, so Grady came and gave her sleeping pills. Not long after, Kelly drove Michael home, but it turned out that Michael had already decided to carry out his crazy actions on suspicion of Grady. He planned to check the closet that Grady kept secret in the basement. When Michael entered the basement, he broke into one closet after another, but found nothing. While Kelly, worried about Michael, desperately went out to tell him in person that Grady had discovered their actions, Grady suddenly stood in front of Kelly and immediately hit her. Grady then dragged Kelly into the kitchen. Shortly, Susan woke up and turned on the kitchen light. She saw Grady busy looking for sharp equipment. Panicked, Grady made the mistake of mentioning the lies he had been building up in the house for half a year. Susan, realizing that something was wrong, immediately ran to save herself while screaming loudly. On the other hand, Michael managed to get out of the basement and immediately found Kelly, who was being beaten by Grady. Meanwhile, Grady's unmasking cover inevitably changes his plan to finish off Susan's family. He chases Susan with a dagger and plans to silence her forever. Susan then fled to the bathroom, and when Grady entered, she immediately attacked him with glass, but apparently Grady was still able to get up and threaten the lives of the three again. Michael took the initiative and invited them to the roof, but unfortunately it was the wrong decision and Michael had to fight his future stepfather. Kelly then tried to help Michael by threatening Grady with a wood chipper, but unfortunately, they fell off the roof because of the fragile wood. Fortunately, the wood chipper did not hit Kelly or Susan. Grady, who was caught off guard, immediately received a strong lunge from Michael, and they then struggled, causing both of them to fall from the roof of the house until they became unconscious. Michael was then rushed to the hospital as he was in a coma due to severe injuries. A month later, when Michael regained consciousness, he was surprised to learn that Grady had disappeared when the police arrived at the scene. While sometime later, in another location, Grady was back in action to seduce a widowed woman.